Dear friends, first of all, I would like to show my enjoyment that we finally have opened this place, and I want to just one round of applause for the only person who is not thanked, which is Katerina, for getting this going. Now, because this whole morning was scientists talking to scientists to some extent, I thought I'd do something else, because I didn't want to compete with people who are so much better than myself, so that makes no sense. So I thought, okay, what is it that we have left out so far? And I think one of the most important issues is the enormous demands for vaccines and how to actually get there in practice. Because it's easy to say, and I must say I have to tell you a little bit about myself in a sense. One important issue is that I moved through academia, through the NGO world into industry. And I had mourning periods at each of these because it's not easy to move from one to another, and they have all different demands. So I also give a kind of view, which is reflected in this talk, on how that kind of differences can be overcome. Now, the first point is, which you might all know, that vaccines are an enormous success. And we all tell that in every talk, how important it is. And in a sense, they are miracles because we don't know how they truly work. And this is not a joke. We tried to already for over 50 years to figure that out. And we talk about correlates of protection, and we want to know the correlate of protection, and we know very little of them, while they should be the guiding post for actually understanding vaccines. And I hope we figure them out. So one of the futures is maybe rational design will come about, but it is still a challenge for all of us to actually get there. Now, what do we know? We know that smallpox is eradicated. This is a very important issue because the correlate of protection is a scar, and a scar you could see. Now, that is an enormous advantage because it's presumably the only true one you know. You don't have to measure anything. You just see that somebody is protected, and it's protected for a long time. This made it possible to eradicate. You had no, first of all, you had no reservoir, which is important. And because you had no reservoir, people walked around with smallpox, and they all have symptoms. So you could see them. So we never have to forget that smallpox was relatively easy. This sounds crazy, but also the correlate of protection was visible. Everything was visible by the eye. Now that is an important point, and it was a great success. Now, I want to point out a little bit on the next issue, that is the volume issue. Because vaccines have to be made to be effective in enormous volumes. We talk about billions. And I just wanted to show a little movie on how vaccines were made and were successful in smallpox.
Calves are the source of smallpox vaccine. Cattle are subject to a weakened form of smallpox called cowpox. Large quantities of vaccine are produced by infecting healthy calves like this one with live cowpox virus. The virus multiplies rapidly, and by the 5th day, crusts have formed on the skin wherever the calf was infected. These crusts are collected. They contain the live germs, which will serve as vaccine for human beings. Glycerin is added as a preservative and to provide a vaccine in fluid form. From this mixture, individual doses of the vaccine are prepared. The vaccine may be supplied in a capillary tube like this and applied directly to the skin from the tube.
Now, why am I telling this? It's very important to realize that this was a success. Now, we are overestimating sometimes technology, and it's a kind of important issue because we are not able to do this anymore. We have these huge QA departments which control everything because side effects become more and more important, and we still have to deliver at the public health level these enormous amounts of vaccines. So now you see the enormous challenge at the industrial level. Whatever the idea is, we're not in the world to protect mice. I don't want to be impolite to anybody here. We're here to protect man, and man is a thinking animal. And I come to that in a second. And then we have to find ourselves in a situation where we have to make billions of vaccines in a way that actually is virtually impossible and under conditions which are not like this. So success is now defined by a lot more complexities than it ever was before. Now then we have, of course, an example of that, which was polio. And everybody of us expected by 2000 we would get rid of polio. Now there's a lot of interesting things to tell. I don't have the time about it, but we all have to realize that OPV is a very poor vaccine. Now this is an important point. It is not more than 60% protective. Now that means that we were, so it shouldn't be totally surprising from a technical point of view that, and thinking of things like herd immunity, that polio vaccine OPV was not that successful so far. Besides the fact, it causes, of course, polio, which you only can see when it drops to a level where it currently is in about 1,000 cases. And then you have the enormous political consequences of if somebody thinks up, like in Nigeria that happened, somebody thinks up that vaccination is not a good idea, then a year later 20 countries had polio again. Now, of course, in small numbers, but these are issues which now play a bigger role than ever. And you also have to realize that the polio campaign, which is not integrated with childhood vaccination, cost $1 billion a year to only eradicate a relatively limited number of cases. Now, that means that we need better vaccines, and we as scientific community have delivered them as well. Now, of course, we still have tetanus there, and that's where children's vaccination have to come up, and these are all actually looking into the future by thinking of the present. And the present is children's vaccines are there, they're just not getting everywhere. We have to realize that still, for instance, if you take the example of measles, the majority of people, and which is, at this point, let's put it that way, about half of the whole population gets vaccinated currently at a level of 60–70%, and there is still enormous gains to make with children's vaccination, which we should really pay attention to. And it's in part because we cannot make enough. This is a major issue. It's not even only price. It's just to produce it. And with polio, it's for sure an issue, for instance. We just can't make enough IPV, which is needed in this case, at the lowest possible price. And there are breakthroughs needed in that area. Now, this was already alluded to earlier, and I don't have to tell it here because it's a little bit preaching for the converted, but it's very important we keep that message bringing out that there are so many people saved by vaccination. However, and I can tell you now from a lot of experiences, that message doesn't work anymore. It's just over. And it will not go away that people will be very skeptical about vaccines, and I will give you some hinges of that, and we have to really work hard what are the communication ways to actually bring that out. Now, one of the most important issues, which is, of course, we have to realize, and the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen actually brought that out, is it's very important to see disease freedom as a part of being free at all, which is a very important issue. And to develop, you actually need to be vaccinated because that gives you the chance to grow up and to actually be productive. And I think that's a very important message, but I said already, it not necessarily everybody will understand that message. And that is a little bit what came out of a lot of studies so far. Now, to just give you a few issues which are, of course, for all of you very clear, but I think it's important to keep realizing as long as we don't have a vaccine, HIV will be a large problem, and it will be not easy to keep lifetime drugs available for people. And in a way, and I thought it was a very smart idea, I was at a meeting at Bellagio some years ago, and then one of the NGO chairmen said, a vaccine for HIV is a kind of exit strategy out of the therapy cost, which is a very interesting view, because it is. And I think if there is anything we should work on is on an HIV vaccine, which everybody agrees on, but I think it's important to see it that way. I mean, we cannot repeat the situation with polio another time where we have to spend this huge amount of money and then lifetime, while we have to spend it on several other issues. That's where a vaccine is so needed. Malaria is an identical problem. I think that that's getting closer, but still the percentage of protection is relatively low. Now, I want to look a little bit in the future And it was already alluded to in the last talk a little bit, and I want to go a little bit philosophical. So as the last speaker, you can do that. Now, first of all, what's very important is population is growing. What does it mean? It means that we get a hell of a lot more kids, and that means that 1 billion vaccines is not enough for children's diseases. And it's a really big challenge to make it under the quality conditions that are needed, because the world is harmonizing. So we have to do that well. And it's not only that the population is growing, it's particularly growing in areas where the infrastructure is not always the best. So it's Africa, parts of Asia. And it's really a big issue to address in the future. And it's a challenge for the interaction between academia, NGOs, foundations, and as well as industry. The second issue, which is particularly in the West, is aging. So I think there will be a new development in vaccines, which is therapeutic vaccines and vaccines for later age. I think that will come up. You see it already coming for zoster. You see it for other diseases which come up, and which might go all the way to vaccines against Alzheimer or whatever if you go into the cellular realm. But the aging population is an important issue for two reasons. First of all, our lifespan is getting larger and larger, which means that we stay healthier longer. And as long as we are not dying, we might be getting ill of diseases again, which we actually didn't expect to get 10, 20 years ago. So aging is an important issue. Then, there are very interesting books on this, is that it looks like the state is actually diminishing in value. You get a world where mega cities and areas are where at least 50% of the people are living in the future. That brings crowding, that brings an enormous amount of diseases around, of which in an interesting way, SARS was an example. If you followed the whole SARS epidemic, it ended up in a few high-rises were the problem, as well as an elevator. As you all remember, the Hong Kong situation and the situation close of there. And then it spread at an immense speed, which is one of my next issues. The other issue is that whatever climate change is going to happen and do, for sure you see more and more changes in weather conditions, and not only that, it brings out a lot of changes in the epidemiology of infectious diseases. You see a lot of tropical infections coming into Europe, for instance, and you see it presumably in the south of the United States. So there will be major changes, and if they're directly related to climate change, I don't know, but you see them happening, which is a surprising arena. Now then, of course, the enormous rise in mobility. We saw that in the SARS epidemic as well, which means that you see now everywhere, wherever you look at, you see that viruses and bacteria spread as immensely fast. So in other words, you need almost global surveillance for a lot of these infections, which needs a lot of cooperation at the world level. Now, I just pointed out so far, vaccines are a great help to human health, and they're needed. Now, if that was the whole problem, we could stop here and I would be finished. Unfortunately, we're actually in a different world nowadays. And I put this a little bit without a question mark, because it's more or less this sentence says, who the hell needs vaccines? And that's maybe not a question you and myself will ever ask, but the rest of the population might ask this all the time, which means that we have to change our attitude a little bit. And data are not so influential anymore as they were before. It's an interesting changing world. Now, I put this one up because this is the internet information on vaccines. And you might laugh at it, and of course it's laughable to some extent, but unfortunately it is a very real world, and we have to deal with it. And for a lot of reasons, because we all know that vaccines can be made, and finally we're sitting on these billions of dosages, and subsequently nobody wants to take them. It makes, and what is underestimated, and people really don't know, that the most important thing vaccines do is actually protecting the uninfected because of the herd immunity effect. Much more maybe important than the individual vaccination effect, which blocks the disease. And you have to have a population which is accepting it. Don't forget that vaccines so far are delivered through an intermediate, being the CDC, being a doctor, And that's a major issue because people accept that less and less, that there are intermediates who actually intervene with their own body and what it says. Now, people are buying this stuff. So we have to realize that people are really literally and figuratively buying this information. And we were very surprised in Europe, and I can tell you one interesting story about the acceptance of the cervical carcinoma vaccine. Very great vaccine, but of course it has a major problem like all vaccines have. That's actually the distance between being sick and actually preventing something is enormous. I mean, treatment is accepted because you see that you're ill or somebody around you is ill. That's relatively easy because people panic at that situation, and clearly they should. However, if you prevent something, you don't see anything, particularly nowadays anymore. What are you preventing? You're shooting something in me and nothing happens. So people underestimate that if you are not vaccinated, you're actually other people at risk, which is an altruistic issue. Now, the things people believe are actually might be fraudulent, like in the case of Wakefield, who actually published a paper in 1998, which I considered irresponsible of the Lancet, first of all, and second of all, because we knew at the time that it was all bullshit, if I may say so, but nowadays we may. However, it was accepted, and if you looked at the statistics which were published in Nature, I think a few weeks ago, you could see the statistics. Essentially, after this paper was published, the uptake of vaccines dropped 10%, which was dramatic, from in the 90s to below the 80s, and you saw a creeping up immediately following with a lag time of about 5 years of measles again, all because of this, and we're still to date not back at the level before this happening. This has major impact, and we cannot be vigilant enough about that. And this is also a statistic which is very important. I mean, we might not believe that it should be, that anybody believes it, but 1 out of 5 Americans believes that vaccines cause autism, and it is not only MMR, which was related to the paper. It's now generalized to vaccines in general. Now, this is an important thing we have to realize, and we have to think about what to do about it. Now, there was a recent CDC point of view, and this is very interesting, and it showed these 3 elements as most important why parents are actually changing schedules, because they don't know that if you're exposed to an infection, you should vaccinate before that. So there are all kinds of crazy schedules to lower the amount of shots. But very interesting, the first point is the pain of the combination vaccine. So I think we should work as scientists, and I take that very seriously, on getting the needle out of the way. Now, this sounds like trivial, but it is not trivial because we all know that if you take the needle away, you get an immunological problem, because that will directly influence the length of your immunity. We have several oral vaccines in our own portfolio, and they can be improved, let I put it that way, on the length of the immune response. So we should think about it, that we actually have to work on these things. The second is fever, which is side effects. So people don't accept side effects anymore. Now, that is a very important point, which in vaccines has to play a role. And of course, autism has nothing to do with it, but that's heavily feared. Now, what am I here promoting? We should more and more, as a community that makes vaccines and thinks about vaccines and drives the science of vaccines, we have to make vaccines that people want. And this is an example of how long the lines are for getting the iPad. And this is a New York picture. This is a New York picture. And what I really hope I bring about, or I promote, is we need lines for vaccines. People have to want it, and want it badly. And I think that's very important, and we ignored it. And it has to do with taking, actually, we cannot put a white coat on anymore and say you have to take them. That is presumably not it's not going to work for iPads, and it's not going to work for vaccines. Now then, communication. Communication is a very important issue on vaccines. We used since the war, we used the left model, which is the model that we have a more or less arrogant doctor who said that you have to take shots. And I love this picture. I mean, it cannot be depicted better. However, the influence nowadays comes from people like Lady Gaga and her followers. I bet that if Lady Gaga would say that all these kids have to take vaccines, and she has 37 million followers in the United States only, something like that, or worldwide. I think if Lady Gaga would say you need vaccines and you have to take them, it would work. So we need alliances in the area where actually people are. And I wanted to tell you earlier on cervical carcinoma, in England they actually did a similar thing. It didn't work to get right uptake for cervical cancer vaccines in a lot of Europe, and neither in the United States. In England, David Salisbury succeeded. And why did he succeed? He didn't communicate himself. He asked via Twitter and via Facebook to actually communicate kids to each other on the benefits of vaccines in this case. And that actually got him a lot further, because they got 80% uptake of that vaccine through this channel, while we in Holland, for instance, got never beyond 30 or 40. Now that is a major message, I think, for us as a community. Now, what is then the future of vaccines? And I want to conclude with, we are not there yet, because there are so many diseases which actually threaten development, and we still have to work on it and work diligently and get them out. And get them out in volumes which public health actually does any good. So I think that means that interaction between, let I put it this way, the scientific community, the NGO community, and whatever consumer communities and industry are needed, because you need somebody who makes the stuff and somebody who invents the stuff and subsequently communicate. Now, what kind of solutions I was saying already is that we have to actually be global in our attitudes, and we're doing that ourselves, but I think the future looks like that the West is not the only area where we have to be active and we have to think about. And that means that we need a lot of attitudes changes as well as being broadly open to solutions which might be different for countries. Now, what is the breakthrough we need? I think one of the important things as responsible people is to actually communicate with the consumer itself. In other words, you have to talk to people, and what is it that keeps them from taking vaccines? And it was previously, these were religious communities. Now it's affluent, young, and I meet them at parties all the time, young parents who say these vaccines are dangerous and we should not take them because they've never seen the diseases. One of my best friends had polio, and then you know, and the kids of those all take vaccines. But nowadays, all of these diseases are gone. So what does it mean? It's the success of vaccines that actually hampers the use of it, which is a very cynical position to be in. Now, I want to show you one form of communication at the end of my talk, which I really like, which is, and you will see it. It's, I think, a way of communication which we now need. So I want to just conclude to say we have to work harder than we ever did, presumably, but not only at discovering vaccines and making them, but also to communicate the use very effectively. And I just want to finish with this presentation.